Hello, g'day. Welcome to Films from Down Under, the art house cinema of Australia and New Zealand. I am your host, Stacey Davies, and I'm coming to you direct from the Outback. A lot of wallabies out there. So this is our quarantine edition of our OSHER program film series. This is a new way of doing things. We're all learning how to do it. I hope that we get through this all right. I wanted to record for you some intros before you watch the films, sort of in keeping with how I normally conduct my courses at UC Riverside, which I have been doing now for 11 years. For those of you who are new to this series, I have created I don't know how many series, a lot, 27 different film courses for UCR over the past 11 years, and repeated some of them, and of course I'm including some summer series programs that I did as well. Anyway, I'm Stacey Davies. If I didn't say that already, I don't remember. I normally don't do things on camera. I have done much on radio, and I'm a journalist, and I have 2 master's degrees, one in professional writing and one in film studies, cinema and media film studies, both from USC. And what else can I tell you about myself? For those of you who have been with me for quite a while, I cut all my hair off. This is my Annie Lennox quarantine hair, and it is definitely wash and wear, so I'm enjoying it. And this is the first time I've had lipstick on in about 7 months. So anyway, what I'm going to do is record every week for you some brief intros. This one is going to be longer because I want to talk about the background of cinema in Australia. But normally they'll be much shorter, and they're things you can watch prior to screening the films, and it'll kind of just give you a little bit of background information on the film, maybe why I selected it, maybe some things to look out for, possibly who's in it that became a larger star, or some kind of context for the film, so that you don't just watch the film and have no idea why you're watching it, and you might have a very different feeling about the film doing it that way, as opposed to kind of letting me ease you into it, because this is art house cinema. Now, the films I selected from Australia and New Zealand are, I would say most of them fall into the art house category. Again, I'm going to talk about Australian film in a moment, so you'll kind of get an idea that almost all Australian film is art house cinema, because they don't really have an industry the way we do, or even other developed countries like Italy or France or India or China or Japan. Their industry is quite different from everyone's. So I've tried to select films that I don't think you've seen, or perhaps maybe it's been a while since you've seen them. But when we get into our live in-person discussions every Monday, we can talk about that. And I actually found a new film the other night that I love, and it's not on the schedule, so I may have to give you extra homework, and we may have to talk about 2 films. But the fun thing is, about doing this online, is that you have all the time in the world to watch the films, and I can talk as long as I want, and you can pause me and come back, you can go to the bathroom, you can eat while we're doing it. So there's a lot of freedoms actually about doing it this way. And it'll be fun to talk to you in person. I hope we have enough to talk about for an hour in the Zoom class. And so my suggestion, what I would like for you to do to help me out as well, since I'm not going to be standing up and lecturing for that entire amount of time, is while you're watching the films, take notes, write down some things that you want to talk about, or that you saw, or perhaps you reminded you of another film you've seen. Whatever you want to talk about, bring that to the class. That'll be really fun for me and for everyone else. And also, another good thing about doing our films this way is that it gives you time to really process them, whereas I know sometimes in the class, you watch them and you're, especially if it's my class, you watch them and you're stunned, and then you have to kind of process your questions, and probably later on, you think, oh, I wanted to ask that, or, oh, I wanted to say this, and then you have those wonderful conversations with each other while you're having lunch or at home or whatever, and I miss out on them. So this is going to be, I think, fun for me as well. Okay, so enough of that. I won't talk as much in the New Zealand intro, but this is sort of the first deal. So as I kind of mentioned before, Australia's film industry is quite different, and it's not known for cinema the way other countries like the United States or France are known for their cinema. And of course, in the beginning of cinema, the Lumiere brothers in France exhibited their short films in 1895. It was the first time they had ever projected them onto a screen. Prior to screening projections, we had Thomas Edison in the United States and some places in Europe, some other inventors who made the peep show machine, where you had to look into the box to see very, very, very short films. So all over the world in the late 1800s, there were little short films popping up. Everyone was dabbling. And they all, in the beginning, were these what we call actuary films, or early documentaries, steamships coming in and out, people getting on and off of trains, people leaving factories. You've seen these clips, I'm sure, these silent clips. So there weren't any feature films, and so you'll be surprised to know probably that the very first full-length feature film actually came from Australia. They were the ones who did it. And this is how it went. In 1906, the director and entrepreneur, he was a theatrical entrepreneur, Charles Tate, he directed a film titled The Story of the Kelly Gang, and it was in fact the world's first full-length feature film. And it traced the exploits of the 19th century bushranger Ned Kelly and his gang. It was shot around Melbourne, and the original cut of the silent film ran for more than an hour, which would make it, in those days, a feature-length film. And it had about 4,000 feet of film, which is a lot of reels that had to be changed, but at least 3 probably. So this was the first film. So Australia, in the beginning of the whole film industry, was off to a roaring start, if you will. The sad thing about the Ned Kelly gang, and I'm probably playing a clip for you right here. The sad thing about this wonderful film is that it's been, so degraded because we didn't film things on advanced film stock in the beginning years and decades. So it degraded very heavily. And to this day, there's only about 17 minutes of this film that you can actually see. And they've tried to piece it together with stills and other things, but it's pretty much considered a lost film. What else? So Australia gets off to this roaring start, and of course in other places around the world, people are also making films. The problem with Australia is that it has a very sort of the culture and the landscape of Australia didn't lend itself to a lot of different types of stories, at least not in the early years. We know now, and in the modern era, that you can make films about people, 3 people inside a house. You don't have to have all of these landscapes and whatnot. But in the early days of films, shooting on location was a big thing. So there was kind of like Australia and the bush. That was kind of it. But these bushranger tales were very, very popular in Australia. One of the other things that's cool about that country is that it is home to one of the world's first film studios. So before Hollywood was even created, there was a film company called the Limelight Department, and that was a studio that was operated by the Salvation Army, and that produced films between about 1897 and 1910, but they were all evangelical material and used mainly for Salvation Army purposes, as well as they shot some private and government contract type films. And I think they made films for almost 20 years, and they made about 300 films. So they were churning out cinema, but this was clearly not popular cinema. This was not something that mainstream audiences would have been interested in at the time. So the Australian film industry has been categorized as a boom and bust industry due to this very unstable and cyclical nature of that film industry. There have been very deep troughs, and there have been, where almost no films have been made for decades. And then there have been very high peaks in which they had this resurgence of wonderful filmmaking, like in the 1970s. And we'll see some of those. I think we're going to see a couple of those films. The Last Wave is one of those. So there were a lot of factors that contributed to this sort of problem that Australia had maintaining its film industry, and that included war. And as I mentioned before, the Australian narratives were kind of limited. It was mostly bushranger films for a long time. But then what happened is that they banned the bushranger films in 1912 because the government felt that it glorified the violence and the robbery and the murder that was perpetrated by these really kind of lawless, awful bushranger type characters. You know, they were based on real people, not specific people necessarily, except for Ned Kelly. So that was a problem. They had this one popular genre, and the government said, okay, don't make those anymore. And they kind of didn't know what to do. Also, while, around the early 1900s, Hollywood, even though it was still mainly based on the East Coast, and people were just starting to move to the West Coast to create Hollywood, the American film industry was making wonderful films. Charlie Chaplin was making films in 1912 and 1913, and so American exports were being shipped all over the world, and Australians said, oh, we love American films. Everybody said we love American films. France was importing our films, and so the American films really took over the Australian market and pushed any kind of native narrative out of range for most audiences and filmmakers. So the Northern Hemisphere took over. But you should know that even though Australia was not making a whole lot of films during the early part of the film industry, and even up in through the 30s and the 40s, we did have some wonderful Australian exports coming in. One of them was Australian actor Errol Flynn, who was born in Tasmania and made his debut in motion pictures in the 1933 Australian film titled In the Wake of the Bounty. Once he became popular in that, he immediately came to California, said bye. Another English-Australian actor, or this time I should say an English-Australian actor, Peter Finch, who I'm sure you're familiar with as well, also made his film debut in an Australian production in the 1930s, and he starred in a war film called The Rats of Tobruk. And I should say there are a lot of Australian films about war, so when I talk a little bit more about it later, I think you're going to kind of get why the Australian narratives weren't that popular. It's like bushrangers or men going to North Africa to fight, in the Australian army. And it's sort of the same kind of film over and over again. So anyway, Peter Finch, as you know, later became the first Australian, maybe you didn't know that, to win an Oscar, but he was, and that was for the film Network in 1976. Who else came from Australia? Rod Taylor, wonderful Rod Taylor, made his film debut in productions in Australia in the 1950s, and then he quickly also moved to Hollywood, where he starred in films like The Time Machine, which I still love. I think it's the best time machine, and The Birds, of course, with Tippi Hedren. In 1958, however, there was a reckoning in Australia, and they thought we better get on the bandwagon, especially after losing Errol Flynn and then losing Rod Taylor in particular, became such a big star. And so the Australian Film Institute was founded, and its acronym is AFI, so we can get that possibly confused with our own American Film Institute, which, is about kind of teaching young directors and students and kind of preserving film. Well, the Australian Film Institute, their AFI, is more like the Oscars. So they hand out awards every year. And in 1958, they began this process of deciding, which Australian films were going to rise to the top, and kind of putting a little bit more money into the industry. In fact, they're quoted as saying that they founded that institute as a way to improve the impoverished state of Australian cinema. So everyone knew they weren't doing very well in that industry. In the early 1970s, this helped. The Australian government began to invest in the film industry, initiating several forms of support for film and other arts, which led to a resurgence of Australian film. And this is what we would call then the Australian New Wave. And this also coincided with Australia instituting the R rating and a rating system. Prior to that, they were still on a censorship system, and if your film was too violent or sexy or whatever, this is up into the 70s, you would just be banned. You couldn't even put your film out. We had also the censorship code in the United States until about 1967, 68, but it was becoming very lax prior to that. So Australia was kind of following our footsteps in this way. And once that R rating came into play, this released the filmmakers, the auteurs from the shackles of not being able to express what they wanted to put on the screen. The Australian New Wave, also considered the golden age of Australian cinema, lasted until the mid to late 1980s, and it was marked by several really iconic Australian productions and directors, as well as the emergence of something they call the Ausploitation Style. The Ausploitation Style, which is a category of kind of low-budget horror, comedy, and action films that exploited the colloquial Australian culture. And some of the films that fall into that are one of the characteristics of Ausploitation, and films, of course, can cross over a couple of different genres, was to show a lot of the outback and to kind of depict the native Australians, like I guess you'd call, in our country, we call them Hicks, right? The kind of deliverance type Hicks. We had that sort of as well. Depicting these people as complete psychopaths and really horrible people. So films that sort of dipped into that, some more than others, would be Peter Weir's film Picnic at Hanging Rock, Ken Hanham's Sunday Too Far Away, both of those made in 1975, the coming-of-age story The Devil's Playground, which rocketed to international acclaim, and then, of course, probably one of the biggest mainstream hits that Australia had up to date was the Mad Max film from 1979, directed by George Miller and starring Mel Gibson, who was making tons of films in Australia prior to that as well, and later. So a major theme of the Australian cinema that also matured in the 1970s was one of this like survival in the harsh Australian landscape, and a number of thrillers and horror films that were dubbed Outback Gothic have been created with that sort of backdrop and theme, such as Wake in Fright, Walkabout, the film The Cars That Ate Paris. Love this poster. I haven't seen the film. I have to see this film. Again, Picnic at Hanging Rock falls into that category. These are all from like the 1970s. In the 1980s, we had a film called Razorback and one called Shame. Now, Shame is the film I saw recently. I just wanted to see which of these might be available in case you wanted to watch them later, and I've stuck them into the playlist on our YouTube channel. I've either stuck the whole film that I found for free or the trailer, so you can decide. But anyway, I watched Shame, and I'm still not over it. I'm still not over it. It's just fantastic, I think. So we'll talk about it. We'll see if we want to add that into our mix and make you watch it, because I want to know what you think too. Anyway, so those were some of those Gothic Outback type films from the 80s. And then in the, I guess it was in the 2000s, another film I almost showed you, but I've almost showed this a couple of times. So I'll almost screened this in a couple classes, but I keep shying away from it because it's so sad, and I love it so much, but it's so sad. Like, I'm just still not over it, and I don't know if I can do that to you. But anyway, it's called Japanese Story, and it's with Toni Collette, and it's just marvelous. And I can't, off the top of my head now, I can't think of who directed it, but I believe it's a woman, and that I think I was going to put it in one of my women directors. Anyway, so this film was a hit Australian film on the sort of art house indie circuit, and there was another film called The Proposition, and then there was a thriller called Wolf Creek, and these are all in the 2000s. So again, all of those films have some element of trying to survive in the Australian outback, or that you're running into people out there who are, not quite right, not quite right in the head. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because Australia is a very different country. It's different than every other place on earth. I mean, the United States has parts of it that are kind of like other countries, isn't it? And there are parts of it that are kind of like Canada, and all of the clustered countries in the Northern Hemisphere have similarities. So you go to Australia, and I haven't been there, but I've seen a lot of film and I've seen a lot of photos and things, and it just doesn't look like any place on earth, really. I would also say that about Iceland, which is where I was last December. Before we called this the before times, when we were still able to travel and do things. And Iceland is also that way. So if we ever get to leave this country again, and you can safely, please go to Iceland. And I'd say go during the winter. I know it looks cold, but it's kind of like walking on, I don't know, Neptune or Pluto. It's a totally otherworldly experience. So that's my aside. One of the other things I wanted to point out, I think in our film selections, I did not include a film that was specifically about the Aboriginal people in Australia. I did look for some films like that, and I didn't find things that were available for us to see, but I did want to point out that one of Australia's most famous actors is David Gulpilil. Gulpilil, I think is how you say his name, Gulpilil. And he will appear he's an Aboriginal, he's a native Australian actor. He will be in our film, The Last Wave. You would also recognize him as Crocodile Dundee's buddy in that film. And he's quite well known and respected. And I really want to find more films that focus on that community. Although the film I mentioned earlier, Shame, from 1988, does have some very interesting Aboriginal characters, at least as side characters. And there is a Australian series out, Mystery Lane. I'm going to have to look it up. When I put this in post-production, I'll put the actual thing up here next to me. It's Judy Davis's new series, wonderful Australian actress Judy Davis, and it has a Aboriginal actor lead. So this is good. I want, because I think it's good that we see, all the people of Australia, not just the colonizers, the former prisoners who were sent there as punishment. I want to know more about the actual people who are from Australia. So maybe if you have some suggestions, you can let me know in discussion if you know some other great films that talk about that experience and that culture. Australian cinema also gave us director Gillian Armstrong with her early hit film, My Brilliant Career, which of course was one of the launching vehicles for Judy Davis and also starred Sam Neill. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1979. And there was also, of course, George T. Miller's feature film, The Man from Snowy River, in 1982, which was critically acclaimed and also featured Kirk Douglas in a dual role as two brothers. One is kooky and one is not as kooky. I gave you the nice picture of the handsome picture of Kirk Douglas, who of course just passed away. I believe it was this year. I don't know what day it is, like most of you. We can't go on without noting that in 1972 as well, director Bruce Beresford gave us a film titled The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie, which I'm sure none of you have seen, and I haven't either, but it is a comedy about a Yabo on his travels to the United Kingdom, and it's a character that was created by Barry Humphries. If you know that name, maybe you don't. I'm very campy, so I know who Barry Humphries is. He was featured in several small roles within the film, and if you don't know him as Barry Humphries, you do know him as megastar Dame Edna Everage, who I had the pleasure of interviewing on the phone once, decades ago, for the OC Register, and she is hilarious and stayed in character the whole time, and I still have the little cassette tape, and someday I'm going to digitize it and put it out there for people to hear because she's so funny. Anyway, the funny thing about The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie is it actually was the first Australian film to surpass $1 million in the Australian box office. And that's because Dame Edna is amazing. But that was 1972. Let's see, what other things did you not know were from Australia or forgot? There was some 80s Australian cinema that you might recognize, including Breaker Morant in 1981 and Gallipoli, that had Mel Gibson in it, directed by Peter Weir, and 1982's The Year of Living Dangerously, which we all knew about because Linda Hunt, I believe, won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, and she was playing a man in that film. Alongside Mel Gibson. 82 was an interesting year. Linda Hunt played a man in a film, got an Oscar. Dustin Hoffman played a woman in a film, and Julie Andrews played a woman playing a man playing a woman in a film. And they were all nominated, and Linda Hunt won. 82. What was going on in 82? What were we doing? Let's see. We also can't forget about Paul Hogan, right? Paul Hogan, Crocodile Dundee. That's when a lot of people suddenly sat up and noticed Australian cinema. And actually, Crocodile Dundee was a really fun, delightful, actually, little film. And I even liked part two, where he comes to New York. Oh, wait, does he come? She goes there. Part one, Linda Kozlowski goes there to find him. They have some adventures. Then they come to New York, right? And then in part two, he's sick of New York, and then they go back to Australia, and I can't remember anymore because it wasn't as good. But anyway, that was 1986. That was a big hit. And we could even include the film A Cry in the Dark as Australian cinema because it certainly was directed by an Australian director, and Sam Neill is in it, and it's set in Australia, and the Dango ate my baby, and Meryl Streep. It's one of her finest performances. Just terrific film. When it was released down under, it was the title was Evil Angels, but I like A Cry in the Dark. And we can't forget, of course, Nicole Kidman, an Australian export who became a huge star. She was in a film in 1989 titled Dead Calm, which also was Sam Neill. Sam Neill is in a lot of movies. Dead Calm is good. It's very, you'll white knuckle it through that. I think it still holds up, but I saw it a couple years ago and it's quite good still, with Billy Zane as well. And you get to see Nicole Kidman with her real hair, her real color, and her real curls. And I don't think she's had any plastic surgery at that point. And God love her. Let her have it. I'm getting there. I have my list of what I want done. I'm just going to keep waiting, seeing how long I can hold out. Anyway, that was Nicole Kidman's one of her final films before she took off to Hollywood because she just had to be in a film called Days of Thunder and marry Tom Cruise, which didn't turn out too well for her eventually. Poor thing. Nicole Kidman has returned to Australia many times to star in other films. Probably one of the more famous ones was Baz Luhrmann's 2001 jukebox musical, Moulin Rouge, which was so wonderful. And we're going to have a Baz Luhrmann film, in fact, in this series, Strictly Ballroom. If you haven't seen Strictly Ballroom, that was his first film. And he's actually only done about 5 or 6 films. So we're going to see that one. The 1990s also saw the hits Muriel's Wedding, which introduced the world to Toni Collette. And if you haven't seen Muriel's Wedding, you must see it. I put the trailer in our playlist. It's so wonderful. And there's a lot of quotable lines from that. Everyone always quotes, Muriel, you're terrible. You have to see it to know. Or, you're terrible, Muriel. I can't remember which way the girl says it. And we also have the drag queen extravaganza, Stephen Elliott's smash hit, The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And both Muriel's Wedding and Priscilla came out in 1994. So now we're in this peak period of Australian film, right? The 90s, we're getting these hits, and then in the 2000s, we're getting Baz Luhrmann comes out, and so everybody's starting to pay attention. Also in the 90s, the film Babe. La, 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 la. That's an Australian film, by the way. And the 1996 drama Shine was an Australian film starring Australian actor Geoffrey Rush, who also won the Oscar for Best Actor for that role. Since the 2000s, Australian cinema has been mostly absent the international scene, not accepting Moulin Rouge. We kind of started getting away from Australian films, or they stopped making them. I'm not quite sure what's gone on, but I think they did have some financial problems. There was a film that was quite critically acclaimed, and it was an Indigenous story. It's called Rabbit Proof Fence, and I almost put it on our agenda, but there were just other things I wanted to show you more, but please check it out if you would like to see it. I think that was in 2002. And then there's kind of a hybrid Australian-French film that some of you know how much I love. It's Anne Fontaine's 2013 film Adore, starring Australian Naomi Watts and Robin Wright, and it's very controversial and it's not for everyone. So if you're a little bit square, do not watch it. But if you're interested in something pretty sexy and really not illegal. It's not illegal what happens in the film. Isn't that what a lot of people say when they do something that's wrong? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Anyway, you might want to check out Adore. I love that film. Let's see. And to wrap things up, I've gone on quite long now. There are tons of other exports from Australia that we all love, like Hugh Jackman, Cate Blanchett, Naomi Watts, who I mentioned, the late Heath Ledger, who had considerable success in Hollywood before his untimely passing. And I do have to do a personal shout out to Essie Davis, who I just idolize. She was in, of course, The Babadook, which is an Australian horror film by Jennifer Kent, which is wonderful. It's really not that scary. It's just super psychologically creepy, and it has jump scares, but I don't think you're going to be afraid The Babadook is going to get you at night. You might, but probably not. But I don't think most of you like horror films. I kind of do. I don't like gore, but I like horror. Horror. That was... right? You got that? Okay. And of course, Essie Davis in Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. We love her. And other wonderful Australian things are Rachel Ward from the Thornbirds miniseries, which had Richard Chamberlain and also co-starred Ward's husband, Brian Brown. We love them. And I couldn't end talking about Australia without doing a shout out to the late, great Helen Reddy, who I first saw in the Disney film Pete's Dragon in 1977. And I was fortunate to see Helen Reddy in concert when she was launching her comeback career. I think it was in 2013. I saw her at the Catalina Jazz place near Pasadena. And she was marvelous, and she sounded exactly like her records. And then 2 years later, she was diagnosed with her illness. So anyway, I love Helen Reddy. She's definitely the best thing Australia ever created. And just keep on roaring, ladies. We need to hear you all the time. As far as the Australian film industry itself, they continue to produce a reasonable number of films each year, but in common with other English-speaking countries, they've often found it very difficult to compete with Hollywood. Our films just take over every market, and every time they get a great actor, that actor has a little bit of success there and then immediately leaves and, of course, comes to the United States to make films. Like other film industries right now, the COVID-19 pandemic saw the shutdown of production in Australia, but actually they've done very well with the virus, and as we all know, New Zealand has done amazingly well with the virus, containing the virus and eradicating it. And so actually Australian film production has started picking up. And so we'll see. I don't know. Maybe a lot of things are changing during the pandemic. Maybe this is their golden window of opportunity of trying something new. I think we're all in that boat right now, figuring out, what the future looks like and how to sort of, make lemonade out of our lemons and still keeping safe while doing it. So anyway, they're still alive, they're still kicking, they're still making things, and we'll see what they export to us. So that's a very, very long me yammering about Australia, and it's certainly not comprehensive. I'm sure many of you will think of other things that I've left out, so please share those when we do our discussion. I would love to hear it. And what else can I say? That's it. This is the intro for Australian films only. We're going to see 4 of those, and then we're going to see 2 films from New Zealand at the end. So right before those, I'll do a background intro on New Zealand, the New Zealand film industry and films that have come out of that country that we have loved and or should discover more about. I think that's it. This concludes our intro to Australian art house cinema. I'm going to shut this off, get some water. I feel like I've been in the Outback. I was going to take a drink, but I probably won't look good on camera. And then I'm going to come back and put up another video to give you a little intro on Flirting, which will be our first film that we're going to see in this series. And thanks for joining me, and I look forward to actually talking to you and seeing you in person shortly. Bye.